Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be talking about my 20 favorite albums of 2021. Overall, 2021 was a year that a lot of people viewed a bit similarly to 2020 in the sense that it wasn't a particularly good year, but a lot of the music that came out of the year actually was pretty great. And honestly, I could see why, because a lot of the releases I heard this year were pretty great. In fact, narrowing it down to just 20 for this list was a very difficult task for me to do because it seemed like we were constantly getting fed new great releases this year, and it seemed like lots of different genres had lots of really great releases too. It was pretty difficult for me to narrow this down to just 20. I do have some honorable mentions that I will be sharing before I get to those though, but yeah, even just narrowing it down to 20 with the honorable mentions was still a difficult thing to do because there was just so much good stuff this year. Now, before we get to the actual list itself, one thing I do want to note is that unlike previous years where I've ranked my top 20 and gone down from 20 to 1 in these videos, instead I'm just going to be going alphabetically by artist as I talk about the albums here in this list. I'm doing away with the ranking, mostly because I don't really see much of a point in it personally, given that all the albums on the list are really great and very much worth your time. So I just feel like it adds like an extra little bit of like a contest to it that doesn't really need to be there. Instead, I'm just going to go by the artist name, just because that's kind of a arbitrary order I can go in that has nothing to do with quality. And instead, I hope you guys listen to what I had to say about the records and pick some ones that happen to appeal to you so you could check them out, find some new great music and all of that stuff. The honorable mentions will also be done in that same alphabetical order, though of course, obviously I had to draw a line somewhere between the honorable mentions and the actual 20 in my actual list itself, much like I had to draw an actual line between what actually is going to be talked about in this video at all today and what I had to leave off. But, you know, I had to draw the line somewhere. There's just no way I could talk about everything I like this year here in this video. We would be here forever. So yeah, with all of that said and out of the way, let's get to the honorable mentions then. Seeing Aesop Rock and Blockhead collaborating again for a full-length album here with this was just fantastic, and I think they both do excellent jobs on this thing. Blockhead's production is great, and Aesop Rock is still an excellent rapper here on this thing too. If you like these two and what they do, check this out. I seem to be in the minority of people who thinks that this is the best new record that Arca dropped this year, but honestly, this is just the one that I found myself engaged with the most. I like the really ambient feel that this record had. I felt like every track on this thing had a really interesting texture to it. I felt like it was just one of those records I found myself getting lost in every time I put it on, but in a really good way. I know it's not necessarily everybody's cup of tea because it is a bit more mellow and subdued compared to some of the more energetic moments on like Kick 3 or Kick 1 for example, but this was still really interesting in my opinion, and I think it was a little bit overlooked this year. This is another fantastic album from Armand, one that sees them collaborating with the Alchemist for production, and I like how his production is a bit different from the kind of things that Armand typically rap over, and I like how it gives this record a little bit of a different flavor from other releases of theirs. Definitely give it a listen if you like hip-hop. Prior to this album, I hadn't really been interested in Halsey's music at all, but hearing that Nine Inch Nails were going to produce this, I decided to check it out, and overall I was really happy I did because this is a really solid pop record. I like Nine Inch Nails' production here on this thing. It's not like super heavy industrial or anything like that. It leans more into a dark tone that still is a bit poppy. It feels very Nine Inch Nails, but at the same time almost like their take on a pop record, which makes sense, obviously, given that this is a pop record. And I think Halsey's vocal performances on this thing are really excellent. I think the lyrics here are really solid. A lot of the tracks are really catchy on this thing, too. Overall, just a really solid pop record, in my opinion. If you like pop music, check it out. This serves as an unofficial soundtrack to the Doom 2 master levels, a collection of maps released for Doom 2 back in the 90s that aren't exactly known for being super great, but at the very least this fan-made album to go along with it seems to want to correct the soundtrack, which originally was just stock music from the original Doom 2, and it tries to give it a bit of a new flavor, and I think it very much succeeds at that. I like how a lot of the MIDIs on this have a sound that feels at times reminiscent of a lot of the elements that made classic Doom MIDIs great, but also mixes in some really new and interesting ideas, some jazzy influence, some trap influence. It makes for some really great stuff, and you like Doom MIDIs, definitely check this out. At the very least, this is easily the best part of the master levels if you're going to be playing them in 2021, or I guess 2022 now. This is an excellent record from legendary Doom MIDI composer James Paddock, a collection of 30 assorted MIDIs of various styles, and all of them here on this thing are really great. A variety of good sounds here that you get, and despite the fact that this is a pretty lengthy listen, it feels consistently fresh and exciting. If you like James' work on previous Doom releases, definitely give this a listen because it's a lot of great stuff. Based on quality alone, this would probably actually make it into my top 20. However, the reason I'm putting it in my honorable mentions is because all of these songs were included as part of the Eviternity Doom fan game that was released back in 2018. And since these songs have already been out there in the world since then, and have only just been released on album for the first time in 2021, it feels kind of weird to put them on the actual list itself. Given that the songs aren't super new, but the songs here are really great. Definitely worth your time if you really like Doom MIDIs and things like that. So that was all of the honorable mentions I had to talk about. So yeah, with those out of the way, let's get into the actual top 20 itself. This is a pretty interesting album, one that is a collaboration between Devin McCallion of Black Dresses and So Drove. Stylistically, it mixes elements of industrial rock and electro-industrial with some poppy sentiments as well. Plenty of catchy moments on this thing. But I think what really makes this project interesting is a lot of the presentation of the ideas on this thing, the themes, things of that sort. I like how this project at various points can feel very upbeat, danceable, even playful in its lyricism, but there are other moments that are very depressing and angry and destructive too. I think that this project is most interesting when it comes to what it's really trying to be within the greater scope of rock music. I mean, the Bandcamp page released for this describes the group as rock and roll savior and worst enemy. I find that to be a really interesting idea, and I kind of get where they're coming from here on this record, I think, with a lot of the lyricism here on this thing. It seems like the group just really has absolutely no care or respect in the world for, the rock music of old and that whole kind of world and idea that's been pushed a lot by, a lot of critics, lots of fans, things of that sort. And instead, I think they find more enjoyment and peace in their own take on the genre here in this thing, one that is a bit more upfront, a bit more personal, one that's a bit more out there and even experimental in some senses. And I find it interesting that in a lot of ways, rock music, I guess rock music, the whole concept of it has been portrayed as a very against the grain sort of music genre, one that goes against authority and things like that and conventions, but over time it's one that has become a bit stale, a bit safe in some regards too, especially as it has become the big music genre associated with older people nowadays. And I think this record is really interesting in how it feels a lot more punk and against the grain than some of a lot of big name rock releases out there, especially when compared to a lot of newer big name rock releases out there too. It feels very against the grain. It feels very pissed off at just the safeness and a lot of the ideas behind that world of rock music, I guess. And I just find that to be a really interesting idea, especially as more time goes on and the more frustrated I kind of get with that whole scene and idea that rock music is like this sacred type of art that just cannot be topped or anything like that. This record kind of goes against the grain in that regard, and I just find that to be pretty interesting. Overall, this is just a really interesting project, one that features fantastic instrumentals, fantastic vocal performances, and some really interesting themes, lyrics, and ideas behind it. Give it a listen. After dropping an amazing record in 2020, Backxwash returned in 2021 to drop yet another fantastic project, one that I feel like is even better than the 2020 record. This one takes a lot of the ideas that were present on that album and continues to expand on them in interesting ways. At its core, it still has that horrorcore meets industrial meets metal sound that made that previous release as interesting and unique sounding as it was. However, here on this release too, I feel like the sound is even more developed. A lot of the beats here on this thing sound amazing. The blend of these genres is done so seamlessly that to anyone out there who's a fan of any of those styles of music, there's something on here that you'll certainly enjoy when it comes to the sound of this thing. And when it comes to Backxwash's performances here on this record, the rapping is excellent, it's passionate, the lyrics here are great as well, mostly talking about personal matters, just really being at your lowest and just dealing with that. It's a very dark record in that sense, and if you feel like you're up to a record that is very dark in its subject matter, but also very unique and interesting when it comes to its sound, this is certainly the kind of release that you're going to want to hear. And also, the features here on this record are fantastic as well. There's a good amount of variety in them, but everyone seems like they bring something unique to the tracks that they happen to appear on, and they complement Backxwash so excellently too. This is just a masterful record from start to finish. One of the most interesting hip-hop releases I've heard in recent memory. Definitely check this out if you like any of the genres involved here, if you like hip-hop, if you like metal, industrial, any of that, check this out. Black Dresses broke up initially in 2020 and then reformed, I guess, in 2021 to make and release a new album, which I'm not complaining about because it's a pretty great album in my opinion. One that still showcases a lot of the same things I liked on previous releases from this group, but at the same time does do some things a bit differently. Most notably, I feel like the instrumentals here on this record are a bit heavier overall. I think they lean a bit more into like industrial rock and industrial metal when compared to previous releases from this group, and I think this slightly heavier edge here works really nicely with what this duo does. I like the heavier instrumentals here on this thing. And I like how while there are tracks on this thing that do go for that more loud, abrasive, like industrial rock sound, there are still also moments on this thing that strip things back a bit more and are a bit more intimate and personal. And I think the balance between those two things here on this record is part of what makes this record as great as it is. Also, the vocal performances on this thing are as great and fantastic as ever from this duo, and as varied as ever from this duo as well. The chemistry between both artists involved here is really great too. Overall, just a really great comeback record from Black Dresses, and I'm interested to see if they decide to drop yet another record at some point in the future, and I'm hoping and expecting it to be great if it ever does come out. Bladee's newest studio album might be the most upbeat and accessible release from him yet, one that I found myself returning to constantly this year. In a lot of ways, this feels like almost an optimistic take on his 2018 mixtape Ice Dancer. There's similar projects in the sense that they go for a more mainstream trap-sounding production when compared to some of his more out-there stuff that he's released in the past. However, I feel tonally both projects are very different, whereas that mixtape was very sad and cold. This one is a lot more upbeat, as I said before, a lot more warm sounding. The production here on this thing is very lively. Bladee's performances on this thing are some of his most passionate to date, and the lyrics here on this thing see him in a much happier state than at any point in the past, really. I mean, on his 2020 releases, all like 3 projects he dropped in that year, he was already starting to move, I feel, towards a more happy, upbeat direction, but I feel like on The Fool, he's kind of reached, at least as of right now, the happiest he's ever really been in his lyrics, and it's just really refreshing and nice to see at the same time. Overall, yeah, this was just a really fantastic cloud rap release, one that if you like Bladee, if you like this genre of music, you should definitely check it out, and it's not a bad place to start with his music either, especially when given the accessibility of the sound of this thing mixed with the more upbeat sound of it. I can see many people getting into this record even if you've never heard a release from him before. Brockhampton returned in 2021 to drop another great record. This one a bit different from their previous releases. I think the most notable thing about this project compared to past releases is how much more attention group member Joba gets on this thing lyrically, and that's mostly because the record thematically deals a lot with the passing of his father recently. And I like how the group really structures themselves here on this thing around this, because it's the kind of idea that, you know, letting one member of the group kind of get a little extra time, that can throw off the balance of things if not enough care is put into things, but that's not the case at all here on this record, because while Joba does get a little bit more time to shine on this thing and share his point of view concerning this issue, all the other group members I feel like are kind of playing like a support role almost to him, in the sense that they're still allowed to talk about their own things and their own experiences and their own lives in their lyrics here on this record. But at the same time, I noticed that on a lot of the tracks on this thing, what they speak about relates back to what Joba talks about in a lot of these songs in a either direct way or maybe not so direct way. Maybe there's just some parallels here or there or some thematic similarities. But I just thought it was a really interesting way that they structured this project from that perspective, having one member kind of be the emotional core of the project while everyone else is there to not only support them, of course, but have their own time to shine too within their own performances. Of course, while thematically this record is really interesting and really personal and all that, it wouldn't be as great as it is if the performances on this thing weren't as exciting as they are too. Every group member sounds like they're giving their best here on this thing. The production is really colorful, very varied, as you've come to expect from Brockhampton at this point probably. There's a good mix of more quirky, kind of experimental tracks, more hard-hitting, straightforward songs like Bankroll, some R&B tinged moments too, some more personal, slower tracks, even some production on this thing that incorporates like some rock elements, some like arena rock guitars and things like that. It's just a very varied listen that continues to see this group growing and developing as they release more music. Excited to see what these guys do next on what's supposed to be their last record. Yeah, very excited for that, and hopefully it will deliver after this fantastic release too. But if you haven't checked out this fantastic record from them, I highly recommend it. Bladee wasn't the only Drain Gang member to drop some really fantastic music this year, as his buddy Echo 2K also released a really fantastic project this year too. Only instead of an album, it was an EP, but it was still really fantastic and a really interesting project as well, that once again sees him switching up his sound for something a little bit different. Whereas his last full-length record was very slick sounding, this sounds a bit rougher. A lot of the production on this thing isn't as clean. A lot of the way that this is just put together feels a lot more rough around the edges, and I think that works really nicely with the overall lyrics and tone of this project being a lot more intimate and personal. Echo's delivery here on this project is really excellent too. His singing sounds fantastic here, and it just makes for a really engaging and interesting short collection of songs. This is not a very long listen because it's only an EP, but it's still one that I found myself returning to over and over and over again throughout 2021. And if you haven't heard it yet, it's definitely something that you should check out. And there was also a video released alongside the entire EP that's also very much worth checking out. In fact, if you want to listen to this thing, I'd recommend doing it along with the video your first time around. It's not a bad way to do it. So yeah, this was a really fantastic EP. I'm very excited to see what else we'll be getting from Echo in the near future. This was a fantastic cloud rap release from this year that definitely leans a bit more towards like the super cloudy, distorted side of cloud rap, because this thing is just covered in like a layer of distortion and things like that. It's like you're barely able to make out the vocals and what they're saying a lot of times on the songs here on this thing. But you should certainly read along with the lyrics as you listen to this project, because the lyrics here on this thing are pretty great. They are definitely worth reading, even if you can't understand what they actually are just by listening to the song itself. But yeah, this is a pretty diverse release in terms of what you get here on this thing. You have your more straightforward banging tracks like Shotgun. You have some more emo rap tinged moments on this thing. You just have some odd experiments packed into this as well, like the track Implosion, for example, almost feels like it's similar in some ways to like a really noisy, distorted rock song, but I don't think there's any like actual like rock elements like worked into this track, you know, like guitars and drums, you know, the stuff you would expect in a rock song. I feel like it achieves a similar sound though just by manipulating certain other electronic sounds to get to like a somewhat similar result, I guess. It's kind of hard to explain, but I just found it to be a really interesting track and just a bit unlike anything I'd ever heard before. But yeah, the vocal performances across this thing, both sung and rapped, are really excellent. The production is constantly cloudy, always really great though at pairing with those vocals, and I love the very consistent atmosphere across this thing too. You get a good amount of variety, as I said before. It's just an excellent cloud rap release. If you like this genre of music, especially the very distorted kind, definitely check this out. Despite being a member down in 2021, Injury Reserve managed to release one of the year's best albums, one of the most interesting hip-hop albums I've heard in recent memory. The production here on this thing is very original sounding. I love the noisy, glitchy soundscapes that the band's able to create here on this release, and I love how both MCs in the group are rapping over these instrumentals, oftentimes performing in ways that they've never done before in the past, applying different effects to their voices in ways they've never done in the past before. It leads to a blending of instrumental and vocals that is just perfect. It sounds like these two things were just perfectly made for each other here on this record, and like no one else would be able to put these two things together other than this very group. The lyrics here on this record are fantastic as well. While this isn't a concept record, it does deal with lots of reoccurring themes: death, change, just dealing with life in the present day, I guess you could say more generally. And some of the lyrics here on this record are among the best in the group's catalog so far. Cuts like Top Picks for You, By Storm, Superman That, and Knees are some of the most potent tracks lyrically that I've heard all year long. Definitely some of the most moving and powerful music in the entirety of 2021. I know this album has been praised a ton this year, and it really does deserve all the praise that it's been getting, because it really is just a fantastic hip-hop release. One of those records that I found myself returning to constantly, one of those records that I found myself thinking about constantly, and one of those records that I'm excited to see what kind of influence it might have going forward in hip-hop and music in general. And just I'm excited to see what Injury Reserve, or maybe what remains of Injury Reserve going forward, decide to do musically coming off of a project like this, because this record here is the kind of thing that doesn't come around very often. It's a very special release, I feel. I'm just really thankful to have had the opportunity to have ever listened to it. So yeah, definitely give this album a listen, I feel. It's a heavy, but at the same time, very interesting listen, unlike anything else out there. This entry is for the offline version of the album specifically. But yeah, this was another fantastic record from JPEGMAFIA. Not one that's necessarily doing a ton that's super different for him, but I think it's just him doing what he does best for a solid set of songs. And what little difference there is does, make for some really interesting material. I think most notably when it comes to the whole offline version of the record and the production, and how it's, it basically allows for some tracks on this album to be a bit more out there and strange compared to some of the stuff he'd be able to do when tied to a label. I think it produces some of his most interesting beats to date, and of course they still have that glitchy, kind of all over the place sound that you've come to expect from JPEGMAFIA, but I feel like the production here on this record specifically is some of his most interesting and varied to date. And of course, his rapping and singing when it does pop up on this thing is really fantastic as well. The rapping is still just as passionate as ever, the lyrics are just as well written as ever, and the singing when it does appear is just as pleasant sounding as ever too. Overall, this was just another fantastic release from JPEGMAFIA, one that if you haven't checked out any material from him so far, this is not a bad place to start. I would definitely recommend it. I was really happy to see the debut studio album from Lil Nas X really stick the landing after some really fantastic singles. This is a project that mostly succeeds by being just a really excellent pop rap album. I wouldn't say that Lil Nas X is necessarily the best rapper or singer out there, but I think what really makes him a great artist here on this release is his charisma, his character, and just also the fact that he can write super memorable pop songs here on this thing. All the tracks here are just super sticky, super memorable, super infectious. They have songs that you just want to come back to over and over again just because of how catchy they are. But going back to the character that I mentioned before, it really is one of the things that sells this record as excellently as it does. You get a good amount of variety on this thing when it comes to a lot of the different emotions Lil Nas X wants to express. You have some sadder, more intimate cuts on this thing. You have some happier, more upbeat sounding songs as well. And while this is all fine and good and all that, I think the thing that really helps push this to be, a bit different from other releases in a similar lane is that Lil Nas X is, of course, very open and happy as a gay man here on this project. And whether it be talking about his struggles as a result of that, or just being really happy and proud to be who he is on some other tracks here on this thing, it's just really great to see an opening gay boys have such a prominent record release this year, especially with some really prominent singles that were pushed from this thing as well. It does help give this record just a little bit of a different personality from other albums in a similar lane to this, and I think it helps make Montero just that much more memorable. But yeah, this is just a well-produced, really catchy, at times really fun, at times very sad pop rap record that I highly recommend to anyone. The singles were really great from this thing, and if you like those singles, I think you'll like the rest of the album too. Sinner Get Ready is one of the most interesting experiences I had in the album format this year. It sees Lingua Ignota moving in a bit of a different direction stylistically, moving away from harsher sounds in favor of a sound that's a little bit more folky, a little bit more subdued, but there still is a very large sense of darkness and ominousness that lurks throughout this project, only it feels a bit more under the surface of a lot of what's going on here rather than directly in your face. And I think this works really nicely given the theme of this record, which is mostly talking about Christianity in the United States, specifically a very Appalachian brand of Christianity, talking about it from a pretty negative standpoint. Not really like an atheistic kind of standpoint, more of like a horror standpoint almost, in a very personal standpoint, talking about how these things might affect people more personally. And I think it works nicely given the tone of this record, like I said before, because it almost feels like the horror lurking underneath the sound of this record is just a lot of the really horrifying things that result from the really dark parts of Christianity in American culture. So the lyrics and themes on this record are fantastic, and the vocals on this thing are amazing as well. Really passionate, really emotional. They really do a great job at selling what this record is about, whether it be in some of the quieter moments on this thing that are filled with unease, or moments like the second track, I Who Bend the Tall Grasses, where the vocals become a bit harsher, and then, that horror that I said lurks underneath much of this record feels like it kind of breaks to the surface for just a little bit, and I think that helps add to the atmosphere of the record a lot. Overall, this is just a fantastic release, one unlike anything else I've really heard before. The instrumentals are great, the vocal performances are fantastic, the lyrics and themes explored here are really interesting, and I love how everything is delivered with this sense of grandness that feels almost biblical in nature. I'm sure it's somewhat intentional given the subject matter of this record, but yeah, there's nothing else that was released this year really like this. Give it a listen. Hushed and Grim is another fantastic album from Mastodon, one that I think is really interesting in their catalog too, given that it's their first double album, and I think they pull off the concept really nicely here on this thing. Stylistically, it sees the band exploring lots of sounds that they have explored to varying degrees in the past. You have some sludgier, heavier moments on this thing. You have some softer moments too, some more progressive leaning moments as well. It really does take a lot of the sounds they've explored and bundles them into a, not super concise package, but, it is just one album and they're all compacted in there. I think lyrically, though, is where this album shines the most. It's a record that deals with death, specifically inspired by the passing of the band's manager back in 2018, and death is far from a new subject for Mastodon, given that a ton of their previous releases have been inspired by the passings of various people around them in the past. And the band, it really just explores it in a really interesting way here on this project, I feel. I think they take the lengthiness of this record and they use it almost as like a tool to get you to feel kind of fatigued in a way, not in a bad way, of course, in a way where you almost kind of get where the band is coming from with a lot of their frustration and sadness on this record. And I really like how this record, while I don't think it is a record that was obviously inspired lyrically by the pandemic we're all still going through and a lot of the death that's caused, I think it's a record that will resonate with a lot of people because of that. Just, I feel like lots of people could probably relate to where the band is coming from here on this thing when it comes to dealing with death, dealing with grief and all of that, even if the deaths that specifically inspired this were from a different cause before this pandemic even started. But yeah, overall, I think this was a really excellent release from these guys, one that continues to see the band experimenting and pushing their sound into new directions. Definitely check this out. Panopticon returned this year to deliver yet again another fantastic piece of atmospheric black metal. This is a record that really just does what Panopticon does best. I love the atmosphere here on this thing. I love the blend of the harsher atmospheric black metal with the more folky, country-leaning Americana stuff. I think they're blended excellently here on this thing. The vocal performances on this project are harrowing. This isn't a record that's necessarily reinventing the wheel when it comes to Panopticon releases. If you've heard any past releases from this act, you think you already know what to expect from this newest record here. However, I think this record just does the Panopticon formula really excellently, and there's few out there in black metal right now that I think are putting out fantastic release after fantastic release, quite like this act is. So if you like atmospheric black metal, and for whatever reason you haven't checked out this band or this album, definitely check this out. This album is not a bad place to start when it comes to this act's discography. This was an excellent little record that I discovered this year, one that stylistically I feel takes a lot of influence from a variety of different internet genres, I guess, styles of music that have gotten really popular on the internet specifically over the last few years. You have lots of really distorted cloud rap elements worked into this thing. You have some hyperpop elements worked into this as well. I also really like how there are a lot of rock elements worked into this thing too, which is a bit of an odd mix, I guess, on paper with some of those other styles I mentioned before, but this album does a really good job at blending these styles in a way that feels really natural and just normal as you listen to this thing from start to finish. And even when it comes to a lot of the rock styles that are mixed into this thing, there's a good amount of variety that you get. Some moments feel a bit inspired by pop punk. There's other moments that feel really grungy in nature. I mean, there's a literal Nirvana cover on this thing that sounds even noisier, I think, than the original version of the song. And it just works really excellently within the context of this project. The vocal performances on this thing are really great and varied as well. You have cloud rap styled rapping here on this thing. You have high-pitched singing. You have, screamed and shouted vocals in some of those more rock-heavy moments too. It's a good amount of variety that you get, but it always works within the given context of the song as well. When it comes to the themes and lyrics here on this project, this is a very personal record, one that's about being transgender, and you could really feel a lot of the passion put into the lyrics here on this project. It all feels very personal, very emotional. It's not exactly an upbeat record. It is very dark. It is very sad. You could feel a lot of frustration in this thing as well. However, it always feels like the artist is being completely 100% upfront and honest with you from start to finish here on this thing. And I just really appreciate a lot of the honesty put on display here in this record. Overall, this was just a super engaging project, one that despite its pretty short runtime of being a little more than 20 minutes or so in length, there is a ton packed into this record when it comes to the themes and lyrics that there are to dissect, when it comes to the variety of different sounds on display here in this thing. There's a lot going on here, and I just found myself returning to this constantly to spend more and more time dissecting and looking into what this album had to offer me. If it sounds like something that would be of interest to you, definitely give this album a chance. It seems to be a general consensus that 2021 was a pretty great year for the Doom community when it comes to fan games and other fan-related content. I'm mentioning this because you probably don't know that, given that it's not a music-related fact on its own, but personally, I'm a really big fan of what the Doom community does, a lot of their fan works, and one of those things I really like that comes out of that community a lot is the music, too. And this year, there was a lot of really great music. I mean, you already saw some of it in my honorable mentions, but probably my favorite soundtrack to come out this year for a Doom-related project was the soundtrack to Skillsaw's Heartland WAD, which was soundtracked by Stewboy. These two have collaborated before, Stewboy doing the soundtrack to Skillsaw's excellent Ancient Aliens WAD that dropped back in 2016, and this combination of the two here again in 2021 also produced some magic. The WAD itself is really excellent, but I won't talk about it much in detail here, obviously, because it's not a piece of music on its own. But the music accompanying it, really excellent too. I love Stewboy's MIDIs on this thing. I love how sweeping and epic they can be at times. They really fit the kind of rundown industrial feel that a lot of the maps in the game themselves have. They just serve as a perfect match for the game that it's tied to, and I just really appreciate it when a game and its soundtrack are able to do that. I know that this is probably going to be one of the harder sells here on this list, given that it's a soundtrack to a fan game that is probably a bit more niche than what my audience is into, but if you are into Doom fan works and you haven't checked out Heartland yet, I would highly recommend it. And of course, if you're doing that, you're going to end up hearing the soundtrack while you play, but even if you don't want to check that out and you just want the music, you could definitely check that out too if you're into like video game soundtracks, because this is some really excellent work. So Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak teamed up this year to drop a really fantastic throwback record. This one harkening back to 70s soul in a really excellent way. I mean, sure, this project isn't necessarily reinventing the wheel when it comes to this sound, but as far as throwbacks go in this style, I haven't really heard many better than this record. This is just such a blast to listen to every single time I put it on. You have some really nice, fun, energetic tracks on this thing. You have some really soulful ballads too. All the vocal performances here on this thing are pristine. The instrumentals are excellent. On a few cuts here and there, you have a little bit of a funk influence too, which was really fun. These two also just have excellent chemistry as well, which is a really pleasant surprise considering I don't think these two have ever collaborated before prior to this, but you know, maybe they did at one point and I'm wrong. Correct me if I am wrong in the comments down below, but I just thought that these two had excellent chemistry here on this record with how they're trading off vocals here on this thing. You know, you have Paak's kind of raspy delivery that pairs excellently with Mars's more soulful, clean sounding delivery, and they just make magic here on this record. And the fact that it's a nice, concise track list too just leads to this being one of those records I can come back to over and over and over again when I'm looking for something short and fun to listen to. Lots of people have praised this record already, and I have to join them here because this was just a really fun throwback. One that if you haven't heard yet and 70s soul is something that you enjoy, give this a listen for sure. The newest record from Vince Staples is one that I haven't really seen get like a ton of strong praise thrown its way, and I'm a little bit surprised given that I think this record overall is pretty great. Maybe it's because it's a bit more of a subdued record compared to some of his previous releases, but I think that there's a ton to dig into here if you give it the time and attention. It's not a particularly long release, but it does manage to use every moment of its runtime to make something interesting and worth hearing. Vince just talks about a lot about his life here on this thing, where he's at currently in his life, reflecting on his past as well. There's a very, I guess, somber mood, I feel like, that covers much of this record. Not to say it's like a sad album from start to finish or anything like that, but the tone of it is just very somber, very down to earth in a way. And yeah, I just love the honesty and rawness of what Vince does with his lyrics here on this thing. His delivery is fantastic as well. The production that's provided by Kenny Beats on this thing is great too. It's a bit minimalistic, a bit more stripped back, but at the same time, it still is somewhat hard-hitting too. I think it's the perfect match for the tone that Vince goes for with his lyrics and his delivery here on this thing too. Overall, this was just a really interesting and engaging short collection of tracks. One that I think was a bit overlooked when it dropped earlier this year. Maybe because, again, it wasn't the most bombastic release in his catalog. It's a bit more subdued, but I think there is still a lot to dig into here with this record, you know, as much as like a record like Big Fish Theory or FM, for example. And if you give it the time and attention, there's a lot to really enjoy here. Ulver's newest live record is easily my favorite of all of the original live albums that they've dropped so far. This was recorded back in 2018, and I find it really interesting that a lot of the compositions here on this thing, you can kind of hear the early roots of some of the tracks that would later be developed on the album that they dropped back in 2020, Flowers of Evil. Only the sound of this record is very different from that record, because whereas that was a really straightforward synth pop record, this one here is this spacier, more ambient leaning electronic project that, you know, occasionally you get a little bit of a melody or a groove on one of these songs that was reused later on, but for the most part, despite these tracks being, I guess, in a sense, kind of a blueprint to something that came out later, all of these songs feel very much their own and have their own distinct personality to them. And listening to this thing from start to finish is an excellent experience. It's such a dreamy, hazy record, one that I just space out to every time I listen to it, but in a good way. The kind of way where the feel of this record just completely overtakes me, and that really relaxing, spacey sound just, it is bliss to listen to. This is like the perfect record to put on if you're like trying to fall asleep. It really just lulls you into its own atmosphere with that first track, and once you're in, you're there to stay. It's a really consistent atmosphere. I love the sound of this thing, And it is a little bit reminiscent, I feel, of a project like maybe Perdition City when it comes to Ulver releases. And considering I love that album, and I know a lot of Ulver fans out there love that record too, this one here was a really pleasant surprise as far as their live records go. Definitely check this out if you like electronic music. It's a really fantastic experience. Again, one of the most blissful records I heard this year. Wolves in the Throne Room dropped an excellent piece of atmospheric black metal this year, which isn't super surprising given that the band is one of the most well-known and respected bands in this style, but it really just goes to show you why they are one of the most acclaimed and respected bands in this style, given that they're this far into their career and still dropping great albums like this one. This is one of those projects that I love to listen to, especially like late in the evening or very early in the morning where I'm kind of tired or a bit groggy, because I feel like it's kind of like a really good condition to be in when listening to a record that's as hypnotic as this one. The atmosphere on this record is immaculate. It's one of those releases that when I put it on and I'm in the right mood to listen to it, I just get sucked into the atmosphere on this thing so easily. The band's able to create this excellent balance between the aggressive side of black metal and the more beautiful side that you often see come through in atmospheric black metal, thanks to some softer instrumentation or some melody that's worked into some of these tracks. It's one of those releases that I just find myself playing over and over again when I want something kind of, not repetitive, but sort of hypnotic, something I can kind of slip into the atmosphere of really easily when I'm in a certain mood to listen to something like this. It's just an excellent atmospheric black metal record, one that, as I said before, continues to demonstrate why these guys are as well known and respected as they are in the genre. On the surface, Oh No is one of the most interesting projects in Xiu Xiu's catalog so far, because it sees the group collaborating with a different artist pretty much on like every single song here on this thing. It's basically an album of collaborations, and one thing I just find really fascinating about this record is just how excellently the band is able to incorporate the variety of different featured artists onto this thing into their own core sound. Every track on this thing feels very Xiu Xiu-like in nature. I know that can apply to a variety of different sounds given that the band has explored so much ground over the course of their entire body of work, but I think this record does a really excellent job at taking different artists and just working them into a sound that works nicely with the band. You have some cuts on this thing that see the band exploring a bit of their noisier side. You have some tracks on this thing that are a bit more ballad-like, some tracks that are even a bit poppier, a bit catchier. You really do get a nice, even covering of a lot of different sounds that the band has explored at various points in their career here on this thing. And I think the band, like I said before, just does an amazing job at picking collaborators for these tracks, and these collaborators really help expand the sound of these songs, push them into slightly new directions for the band, and you just end up with a really solid set of songs on this thing. Something that is certainly in some ways reminiscent of certain ideas the band has toyed with in the past, but at the same time is very much new and unique for the band at the same time. Definitely check this out. And so that was my favorite albums of 2021. Like I said earlier in this video, it was a fantastic year for music with lots of great releases, and all the albums here on this list are very much worth checking out, even the ones that were in the honorable mentions, because honestly the quality of those records isn't really too different from the quality of a lot of the records that actually made it into the actual top 20 itself I talked about here today. But I did have to draw a line somewhere for this list, because if not, this video would probably drag on a bit too long if I talked about those honorable mentions in more detail, and honestly, this is already going to be a long video as it is, and I don't want it to be any longer because I'm sure you guys don't want to sit and hear me talk about music for much longer. So yeah, definitely make sure you take the time to check out all of the entries here on this list, as well as all of the honorable mentions too. They are very much worth your time. And yeah, with that said, make sure you also leave your own list of your favorite releases in the comment section down below, because I'm sure there are some great releases out there that I happen to not hear, and I like to see those recommendations, and I'm sure other viewers would like to see your own list too to get some other recommendations from it as well. So yeah, thank you guys for watching this video, and stay golden.